Yesterday, 5 men were jailed for more than 7 decades for non-recent child sexual exploitation in Rochdale.
Well, here to tell us all about it is GB News investigations reporter Charlie Peters. And by the way, Charlie did some great reporting in the Middle East after the war broke out.
Thanks, Andrew. Well, there has been some justice in the northwest yesterday after the news we just heard about shutting down that very sad story. We do have news about 5 men being jailed for non-recent sexual assault charges and indeed charges regarding rape as well. Their surnames are 2 men by the name of Ghani, Hussein, Kazmi and a man called Rhodes from Blackpool. This is for the abuse of 2 girls between 2002 and 2006. Some of the details of the offending are extremely horrific, but the abuse started in 2002 when girl A had a chance encounter with one of the men surnamed Ghani, and that started a cycle of abuse, the typical routine that we so sadly often hear about with these incidents of abuse gangs, plied with alcohol and drugs, picked up outside their school, often met while still in their school uniforms. And this incident was only reported to police in 2015 when this girl A, told on a parenting course, detailed how she had been raped and abused by these men well over a decade before. Well, Rochdale Council passed this information to the police, and the police, after this sentencing finally achieved yesterday, said that this is a multi-agency approach. It's taken a long time, but we've got there, and they thanked the victims for all their support.
But even if she raised the alarm at 2015 and it's now 2023, that's another 8 years that took.
Speaking this morning to Maggie Oliver, a former Greater Manchester
she's a great woman.
Greater Manchester Police whistleblower, she said that many of the survivors she's working with now are saying that the police and the council are taking far too long, and the CPS has a tremendous backlog of trials. Of course, we've seen this covered very readily over the last couple of years. But when it comes to these victims, these survivors of abuse, keeping their trust in the authorities is so key to achieving that justice, keeping them engaged with the work. And an 8-year gap, campaign is saying this morning, that's just far too long. It's just far too long. And so many of those survivors from that period, a 2-decade gap, of course, so much of the reporting from that time was a failure. Greater Manchester Police has admitted they didn't do enough. They are now worrying that they're going to lose the engagement of those girls in ongoing investigations.
And often those girls, Charlie, in these terrible grooming gang stories were girls from difficult backgrounds, maybe broken
chaotic
homes,
family life,
perhaps in care,
vulnerable.
And you sort of think perhaps the authorities just didn't care quite as much.
Classism is clearly an element of the failure for the reporting from 2 decades ago. There's no doubt about that. In many of the cases across the country, up to 50 different towns where we've seen cases of child abuse rings occurring in this style, it's clear that a classist element was there.
And you say the victim was on a parenting course, so she's now presumably was a new mother in 2015 when she made the statements of what's happened.
Well, so many of these victims are young women with their own families and their own lives, and I've met many of them over the last year investigating this work with GB News, and many of them say, you know, they fear that the situation they went through in the early noughties and some in the 90s, there hasn't been a sufficient improvement, and they're now raising their own children in
Very briefly, Charlie, there was also the race element too, about the authorities not wanting, because often the gangs were from an ethnic background.
Political correctness has undoubtedly been prioritised over the safety and security of women. This is an ongoing testimony made by victims, and indeed many experts in the field support that view as well. And it appears to be the case that much of what happened in Rochdale, particularly with the failures in the early noughties to look into this investigation, was driven by a preference to look the other way if abusers were of a British-Pakistani background.
It was British-Pakistani, wasn't it? Yeah.
Thanks, Charlie.